In this episode, I wanted to share some thoughts on how it is that we navigate through the world individually and the consequences that has for us as a society. So there's a certain concept when you're thinking about complex systems like ourselves and how we function. There's this concept of attractor dynamics or attractor states. So when you have a simple system that can be described through kind of linear models, in a linear system what you might have is an input that then produces an output in a reliable, simple way, and this is usually modeled as a slope on a line on a graph, and that slope can change. One can vary at a different rate to the other one as they change, and this is quite a simple way that a system can function. Now, we are a non-linear system. We are not like that. We are comprised of complex feedback loops and interesting dynamics that mean that when you produce a change in one thing, it produces a chaotic, complex, rich, dynamical change in everything else. So if you want to intellectually model that, you want to understand what's going on in a complex system, people have found this concept of attractors to be useful. So if you have a system, we'll take a simple complex system, like a pendulum. It's actually not really complex, but you can think of the initial input you give it, some motion in one direction, and instead of it just moving a certain amount, it engages in a certain behavior. The geometry of the pendulum leads to a certain cyclical pattern as it kind of rocks back and forth. And if you wanted to plot that on a graph, you could plot, say, the velocity at which the pendulum is moving and the angle from the top. And in a frictionless, simple scenario, what you would see is that pendulum would just keep going back and forth. And if you plotted that on the graph, there would be continuous change in the velocity and the angle, and then that would make a circle. So you'd see on this graph just you're modeling what's going on with the pendulum. It's moving in the circle. So that's a certain kind of attractor dynamic. In this space this abstract space we've defined on the graph, you've got a certain pattern that the system gravitates towards. Now, actually, what really happens is with the kind of friction in the air and the natural forces as energy is dissipated, there's a reduction in the angle and in the velocity. So what you'd really see is that this dynamic would spiral inwards to the center of the graph. And so that's the attractor state. It's being attracted towards a certain state. Now, it doesn't have to be a two-dimensional graph. Mathematically, you can make this as many dimensions as you want, and you can represent loads of different things. Each axis could be the firing of a neuron in a brain, a node in a complex network. It could be anything. And then you can make these high-dimensional representations where you can look for attractor states. Are there places in this state space that the dynamics move towards? Now, this is getting a bit heady and abstract, so don't worry if you're not following the precise nature of the way we're doing this in the modeling. But you can think of this as, there's we don't just have, we're not completely unbiased as to what states we'll end up in as complex systems. I'm sitting here and my dynamics are governed by a strong attractor dynamic around breathing. So if there's too little oxygen in the air, or if my throat is constricted, there'll be all these dynamics in my system that will try to bring me back to a healthy, natural breathing pattern. And this is something that's described in Colfriston's free energy principle. I spoke to him about in the podcast, that living systems really occupy these kind of small domains of certain attractor dynamics. We go out, we get into these kind of patterns, and we just follow in these little loops. We might eat food, and then we'll go and expend the energy, and then we eat food again. And that's kind of what it is to be a living system, is to bounce between these little attractor pockets. And so you can just think of them as kind of having a magnetic pull or an attraction. That's why they're called attractors. Now, here we're talking about the kind of physical operation of a complex system, but there's also a corresponding psychological feeling that goes along with a certain attractor state. So think of thirst and the desire to drink water, or hunger. The physical system is gravitating towards a certain behavior, and it goes along with a certain psychological subjective feeling and consciousness. Now, as a side point, this is, in the living mirror theory, I'm offering a way of thinking about why that is. So those are kind of two ways of looking at the same operation, that they necessarily go hand in hand, that when a living system is gravitating to these behaviors through its kind of operation as a living system, there's a corresponding subjective feeling. They're the same thing, really, looked at from two different perspectives. And a lot of almost the core problem with consciousness, when it's approached as something that happens just in nervous systems and creatures like ourselves, is we're kind of asking questions like, well, it's like saying, given that we don't want to say that's true in plants and simpler organisms, what magic trick is the brain doing that can bring consciousness along in these certain instances when a human is thirsty, but not when a plant is gravitating towards moisture in the soil. So that's a little side point. But it's important to say that there's this corresponding subjective feeling as we gravitate towards certain states. So what this has to do with the future of us as a species and how we individually operate in the world is certain things feel right to us, certain things we gravitate towards. And as I say, this could be thirst, this could be hunger and eating food. We don't gravitate towards thirst. When we are thirsty, we feel this gravitational pull, to use an analogy, towards drinking water, right? So with this concept of attractors, we can think about, instead of just these simple instincts that we all share, there are higher level attractors at play when we engage socially. So, with these social primates, we exist in networks with each other, and there's clearly, in the history of kind of Western civilization that's led to the modern world today, one of the ways you could boil down what that trajectory has been, I think, is to say that it has been guided by the attractor, the appeal, the psychological subjective appeal of power. So when you're in the psychology of being a relative separate organism, part of your psychology, part of how you operate is to try and get some control over the world. That's a necessary part of being a living system. And in addition to that, there's also the interconnected way we exist. Whilst a chimpanzee in certain moments may engage in kind of violent behavior to get food for itself, we can contrast that with a plant, say, that's producing fruit that then we eat, and there's a kind of a non-aggressive, non-competitive, mutually supporting dynamic going on there. So it's not just competition. There's different organisms at different times use these different modes where you're in a kind of unitive, interdependent, flourishing mode of operation, and then also a kind of competitive, differentiated, relative, separate mode of operation. And so in the psychology of being kind of separate and competitive and primarily focusing on yourself, then power, the ability to affect the world and affect others, that feels like a secure place to be. And so in a moment when you're feeling anxiety or you're not sure what to do with yourself, this could be in a single moment that leads to aggression, this could be someone planning their entire lifetime in their career. Power can be seductive. And this makes sense at a kind of biophysical level, thinking of us as thermodynamic living systems, but we see it at kind of highest levels culturally and in the minds of and aspirations of individual humans. So that, I think, is the trajectory we've been on, and that we're continuing to go on at the moment, and is something that needs to change if we're going to improve our lot as a species on this planet. But then it's counterbalanced by a capacity for a different attractor. which is more the kind of stuff that I tend to talk about here, which is again, if you're in a state of, if you're feeling subjectively a sense of confusion or feeling lost and not knowing what direction to go in, power can be one attractor. But also this mode of open surrender that leads to a sense of unitive connection, that can also feel like an attractor in these moments. And to me, it's the more appealing, the more wise attractor, because not only does it lead to individual kind of grounding and a sense of feeling connected and at home in the universe, and also the corresponding healing that goes along with that, as you go from a mode of fear and separateness and trauma to a mode of feeling safe and connected and grounded, and like you're identified with the unfolding of the universe that will still go on after you've died. So all of these amazing positive things come with it. But it just seems that we exist as these embodied, relatively separate organisms, and so the psychology of fear and fear around surrender, fear around annihilation into just the churn of nature, that is part of our psychology and our makeup, and it will always be there. So it's not as simple as saying, why can't we just align with this unitive mode? Because if we did, we wouldn't exist as separate self-perpetuating systems. So this is the kind of bind we're in. And it seems to me that the wisdom is in having a balance of these two. And in the past, it seems like cultures that survived were ones that did have a balance of these two, that engaged in practices, whether it's kind of plant-based shamanism or meditation, and techniques that allowed us to connect with this feeling that's very obvious when you feel it, of the direction that you want to be moving in as being this kind of grounded, connected, unitive, non-dual direction. And for me, with all of my entire approach to using psychedelics therapeutically and meditation and healing, all of this is framed within a recognition of this unitive perspective. So usually, and I think having had a kind of glimpse of the non-dual nature of our situation is a very useful starting point to then be able to know what direction surrender is, what it feels like to know that it's safe and that it's okay to move in that direction. And so as we see psychedelics becoming more and more mainstream, I think it's essential that we talk about this particular attractor, this kind of holistic, unitive attractor that subjectively it feels like unity, but it also subjectively can feel like love as well. It can feel like this, what we label as love is this very strong, very real feeling of connection that leads us into that unitive state. So when you see people talking about the wisdom of love and a sense of transpersonal love that's feels more fundamental than the kind of love that you might associate with a feeling of being a separate self, I think that's what they're talking about. In my experience, you can have these experiences that a single word doesn't do it justice, but love is quite a grandiose, word when used properly. So that's the word we use for it. And so, interestingly, this is not teleological. These attractors, even though they're pointing towards us moving in a certain direction, we're not being pulled from the future by a certain destination. It's a way of thinking about the dynamics of a system that exists in the present and what they're gravitating towards in their operation. So there's nothing pulling us in the future. There's no destiny that we're definitely heading towards. Side discussion around determinism and the nature of physics, but that's not the point I'm making. I'm not saying that we're going to gravitate towards the best attractors, although nature itself functions as an incredibly stable, it's characterized by incredibly stable attractor dynamics. So if you think of the whole global system of nature, no matter what we do to it, we will never, short of intentionally trying to nuke the entire world and destroy life. Nothing we do accidentally, I think, is going to permanently damage nature. It's characterized by these dynamics of rebounding and rebalancing and an incredible resilience that just come out of its these evolutionary dynamics of a kind of the things that succeed, and then they're the ones that continue to exist. And so it's stumbled on incredibly successful strategies for continuing to exist. And so it's resourced with those and will continue to exist long after we're gone. But what we're experiencing with the appeal of power and control over nature, that seems to be a transient attractor. That's something that, it's something that's existed within us and within other organisms probably since life first began in some form. But the level at which it's come out of balance is a novel phenomenon. So the dynamics we're currently experiencing, I think, are transient and are not sustainable. And so we could either try to notice this, bring it to awareness, and then shift towards this more positive attractor individually, and then that will have the effect of moving us collectively. Or naturally we'll kind of self-destruct, and then the attractor dynamics of nature will take over again. But thinking about it in this way, I find it quite reassuring, because another way of thinking about this, where you don't realize that we have this innate taste for this attractor of unity and freedom and subjective feelings of liberation and connection and healing. If you don't realize that we have that as a deeply appealing thing that we can all feel, then the problem seems like power is very seductive, domination is very seductive to some people, and we have to kind of fight to dismantle that, and we have to really actively work to construct something that could replace it. Whereas actually I'm saying there's something that can innately pull us into a better direction. And so we'd be harnessing natural forces that exist through us. And to me, that's the existence of those forces is, again, by forces I just mean the dynamics of being a living system, but the existence of those I find reassuring. There's something that we could harness to move us into a better situation. And the final thing to say is that whilst the attractor of power is appealing in a kind of short-termist thinking way, it leads to a situation where we know something's not right. The grounding unitive attractor leads to a feeling of release and kind of Gnostic knowing that that you are the universe and that this is what you've always been, and there's this deep recognition that this is the ground. But when we retreat into separation, there's like a splitting off from the rest of the world and a disidentifying with the rest of existence. And so it can never be the whole picture. And the history of our kind of Western civilization has been engaging in construction of technology to control the world, to have more power, pushing into separation. And then what goes along with that is what we see now, the kind of modern mental health crisis and kind of complete crazy levels of ungroundedness and emotional stress and strain. And so it's not that the power attractor is as good a signpost as the unitive attractor. It will always lead us into suffering. It's a short-term tempting thing and can be used in certain circumstances wisely, but it's a kind of a subset of the greater picture that we always have to come back to a sense of home and connection and unity. So thanks for listening. I hope that's been vaguely interesting. Until next time. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cooke.